In 2011, a restoration team working beneath Topkapi Palace broke through a false wall. They were contractors, hired to check structural damage after a minor earthquake. They were looking for cracks in the foundation. What they found instead stopped the work for 2 days. Behind the false wall was a small chamber, no windows, no ventilation, no drain, and carved into every surface, crosses. Dozens of them, small, crude, cut with something that wasn't a chisel, wasn't a knife. The site director called a historian from Istanbul University. She arrived 2 hours later. She walked in. She stood there without speaking. Then she crouched down and held her flashlight at a low angle against the wall. The crosses weren't random. They were deliberate, organized, some grouped in rows, others scattered between what looked like words, Latin words, worn by 5 centuries of darkness and damp, barely visible. 4 words. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness. She recognized the phrase, Gospel of John, a verse about light that cannot be extinguished. But that wasn't what stopped her. What stopped her were the crosses themselves. Some were careful, made by someone with time and patience. Others, toward the end of the wall, were deep, frantic, cut over and over into the same spot until the stone had cracked, as if someone had been pressing harder, getting more desperate, and then stopping. The historian stood in that chamber for a long time. Then she said, "This room has no official purpose. It was never supposed to exist. Above it, the most powerful palace in the world. Below it, a room in no Ottoman record, no architectural plan, no administrative document, no name, no purpose, no date, just crosses. And a question that took historians years to answer. Who carved them? And what happened to her?" To understand who carved those crosses, you need to understand what happened 58 years earlier. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The city had stood for over 1,000 years. It had survived sieges, plagues, and the collapse of everything around it. It fell in 53 days. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old. He rode into the city before the fires had stopped burning. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral in the Christian world. Built in 537 AD, the dome that had defined the skyline of Christendom for 9 centuries. He walked inside, looked at the mosaics, looked at the golden crosses, then gave his orders. The crosses came down within hours. The mosaics were plastered over. The bells were melted for cannon. Within a week, the call to prayer echoed from domes where hymns had sounded for 900 years. But Mehmed wasn't finished. He understood something most conquerors never grasp. Killing people doesn't end a civilization. It creates martyrs. Martyrs inspire resistance. Songs are written. Children named after the dead. Stories passed from generation to generation. The fallen become more powerful in death than they ever were in life. He had a different strategy. When he looked west toward the scattered remnants of the Byzantine world, the islands, the monasteries, the mountain communities that had survived the fall, he didn't see enemies. He saw a problem that required a specific solution. Every monastery that still stood was a declaration. Every church bell that still rang was defiance. Every nun who still prayed in Latin was living proof that the old world refused to die. So the Sultan made a decision. Not massacre, erasure. The mechanism was bureaucratic, methodical, quiet. No armies burning everything to the ground. No mass executions that would generate outrage and memory. Instead, paperwork. An administrative system so thorough it could process an entire community and produce nothing but ledger entries. names replaced by numbers, people replaced by categories. A woman who had spent her life in prayer became, in Ottoman administrative language, a unit, classified, filed, assigned. By 1470, this strategy had been tested across 3 continents. The pattern was always the same. First came the soldiers, then came the translator, then came the offer. Convert, and you will be granted protection. Refuse, and you will face the consequences of rebellion. Most communities made a calculation. Faith could survive underground. They converted, or appeared to. And the Ottoman administration filed another ledger entry. Community neutralized. Threat resolved. The convent of St. Catherine was different. It sat on a hillside in the mountains of Thessaly, far from any garrison, far from any ally. 23 women lived inside its walls. They had no strategic value, no wealth, no political connections. What they had was a bell. And every morning before dawn, they rang it. To Hasan Pasha, the Ottoman officer commanding the 1470 Thessalian campaign. That bell was not a sound. It was a problem. He made a note in his campaign ledger, Convent of St. Catherine, Thessaly Highlands, 23 women, status, unresolved. Then he turned his column south toward the mountain. Sister Eleni had been abbess for 12 years. Before that, she had tended the sick in a village that no longer existed. Plague, 1448. She had survived because she was away collecting herbs when the sickness arrived. She came to the convent not to escape the world, to make sense of it. She understood geopolitics in the way isolated communities sometimes do, with the clarity of those who watch from a distance as empires rise and fall. She had been watching the Ottoman advance for years. She knew what it meant. Sister Magdalena was 19. Her hands still bore the calluses from her father's farm. She had joined after her family was killed in a raid. The convent was the only place she had felt safe since. Sister Theodorus was 70. She had outlived 2 abbacies, 3 emperors, and more wars than she could count. She had stopped fearing death somewhere around the age of 50. The morning began normally. Lauds at dawn, the bell ringing across the valley, the smell of bread from the kitchen. Then the first cannonball hit. It struck the bell tower, not the gate, not the chapel, the bell tower. Stone doesn't just break. It explodes. The iron bell mid-swing when the shot hit shattered. The pieces rang as they fell, a terrible descending chord. They landed in the courtyard herb garden, the same ground the sisters walked every morning. Sister Eleni didn't scream. She stood in the courtyard and raised her silver crucifix and began to sing, Kyrie Eleison, Lord have mercy. One by one the others joined her, 23 voices rising through the smoke and dust. Empires don't listen to songs. By midday the gates were open. Ottoman soldiers entered the courtyard, not with swords drawn, with ledgers, quills, ink pots. They moved through the convent like clerks, counting, recording, cataloging. To the Ottoman administration, these women were not people. They were assets. The translator stepped forward. A Greek man from the valley below, his face tight with shame. He read from a scroll. By order of Sultan Mehmed II, those who convert will be granted protection. Those who refuse will face the consequences of rebellion. Sister Eleni stepped forward. She spoke in Greek, clearly, so that everyone could understand. Tell your Sultan that we have already given our lives to a king. We have nothing left to surrender. Hasan Pasha, standing at the entrance with his arms crossed, heard the translation. He didn't respond with anger. He smiled, because he had heard this before. in a dozen mountain communities across the empire. He knew what came next. That night the women were locked inside their own chapel, doors sealed from outside, no food, no water, just darkness, and the sound of soldiers outside, eating, laughing, living. 2 younger sisters began to weep. Then Sister Magdalena began to whisper, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." One voice, then another, then another. The weeping didn't stop immediately, but it changed. On the second day, a servant entered with bread and water, clean water, fresh bread. He placed the tray on the floor and left without looking at anyone. Sister Theodorus looked at it for a long moment. They want us to feel grateful. Gratitude creates obligation. Obligation creates compliance. She turned to Eleni. If we eat their food, we have already begun to yield. Eleni looked at her sisters, saw the desperation in their eyes. Then we fast. They didn't touch it. On the third day, Hassan Pasha came himself. He stood in the doorway. "You are not criminals. You are not enemies. All you must do is speak the words." Silence. "Or you can come with us to Constantinople. The Sultan himself may wish to hear your case." He paused. "But the road is long, and the weak do not always survive it. Not a threat, a description." Sister Eleni looked at her sisters, some barely conscious, some praying with closed eyes, some staring at the floor. She turned back to Hassan Pasha. "We will walk." The smile returned to his face. "Good. We leave at dawn." They left in the gray light before sunrise. 23 women. Hands bound with rope, no carts, no horses assigned to carry them, just their feet, the mountain road. And the soldiers. Hassan Pasha made a final note in his ledger before the column moved out. Religious captives, female, 23. Destination, imperial household. The road south through Thessaly is not kind in summer. Rocky, exposed. A sun that has no mercy at altitude. By the second day, Sister Irene collapsed, 62 years old. Her knees had been failing for years. She tried to stand, her legs refused, the soldiers didn't stop. Sister Magdalena dropped out of the line without asking permission. Sister Anna followed. Together they lifted Irene between them and rejoined the march. They carried her for 3 miles. When the column finally stopped for the night, Irene was unconscious. Sister Magdalena held her hand through the darkness. By morning, Irene was gone. The soldiers allowed them to bury her. A shallow grave by the roadside, dug with bound hands. Loose stones pried from the hillside to mark it. Sister Theodora said the words from memory, her voice entirely steady. Hassan Pasha updated his ledger, 22 remaining. On the 4th day, Sister Callista stopped walking. She sat down in the middle of the road. She hadn't spoken since the morning the bell tower was destroyed. Now she sat, closed her eyes, folded her bound hands in her lap. A soldier approached, spoke, got nothing. Hassan Pasha rode forward, looked at her, made a gesture with his hand. The column moved around her and continued south. They left her there. By the 7th day, something had shifted in the women who remained. The weeping had stopped, not because the grief had ended, because grief requires energy, and energy was a resource they could no longer afford. They walked in silence, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. Something had been refined by 7 days of walking and loss into something almost unrecognizable. Everything unnecessary had been stripped away. What remained was what had always been at the core. At the port of Volos, a ship was waiting. Sister Eleni counted the women behind her, 18. She looked at the harbor, at the warship sitting at anchor. She turned to the 17 women behind her. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the road and walked down to the harbor. A ship's manifest discovered in 1987 in Topkapi Palace Museum lists them, not by name, by number. Religious captives, female, 18. Destination, imperial household. Purpose, domestic service and conversion. The voyage lasted 12 days. At night, Sister Magdalena whispered psalms in the darkness of the lower deck. The other prisoners, Greeks, Serbs, Italians chained beside them, turned their heads to listen. For a moment the sea seemed to still. When the ship entered the Bosphorus, the sisters were allowed on deck. It was dawn. Constantinople rose before them. Nothing could have prepared them for it, even occupied and renamed. It was enormous. The dome of Hagia Sophia caught the first light and threw it back at the sky. Minarets rose above everything like needles, above a horizon remade in the image of a different faith. It had been the greatest city in Christendom. Now it was the capital of the empire that had consumed them. One of the younger sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." They were marched from the docks through the imperial district, past ancient walls, through gardens where fountains sang, and then, in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the soldiers stopped them, forced them to their knees on the cobblestones. As the call to prayer began from the minarets, the sisters knelt in the shadow of the building they had known all their lives as the heart of their world, and heard for the first time what had replaced the bells. They were taken through a servant's entrance, down stone stairs, through corridors that narrowed as they descended, into the deepest part of the palace foundation, not to the grand halls, down, to a place that had no official purpose, no name in any document, and the women from St. Catherine's were assigned to the rooms below. The days had a structure, before dawn, kitchens, laundry, wherever they were needed, silent, supervised, efficient. By day, servants, women without names, without history. By night, something else. It began with Sister Eleni. On the first night, in the darkness of her chamber, she began to whisper the evening prayers, barely moving her lips, just under her breath. The next night, Sister Magdalena heard it through the wall. She pressed herself against the stone and listened. Over the following weeks, they found each other, not through planning, through sound, through whispers in underground corridors at night when everything else is silent. The room they found was in the farthest corner of the tunnel network, small, low ceiling, no obvious architectural purpose, perhaps a storage space built and then forgotten. They began to gather there. No priest, no altar, no Bible, just memory. They had spent years committing the liturgy to memory as part of their formation. Now that memorization became the only thread connecting them to who they had been, they recited psalms, not always perfectly. Some edges had blurred with time, but imperfectly remembered scripture, whispered in a forgotten room at midnight, carries its own kind of weight. They fashioned what they needed from what they had. A shard of mirror shaped into a crude cross. A scrap of worn linen became an altar cloth. Broken pottery served as candle holders, and into the walls of this room they carved, one scratch at a time, crosses, small, cut with broken pottery, or, when nothing else was available, with fingernails pressed hard enough and long enough against stone to leave a mark. They knew no one would see them. They carved them anyway, because the act of carving was itself a statement. We are still here. We have not disappeared. A Venetian merchant held in the palace for ransom in 1478 wrote home about strange sounds in the lower corridors at night, women's voices singing in Latin, almost inaudible, but unmistakably Latin. He assumed it was his imagination. He mentioned it again 3 months later, still hearing it. For centuries, historians dismissed these accounts, until 2011. Sister Magdalena left her own mark in the corner, a small bird, barely 2 inches across. Beside it, 23 vertical lines. One for each sister who had knelt in the chapel at St. Catherine's on the last morning the bell rang. The archaeologists counted them. 11 were complete. The rest trailed off. Each incomplete line represented a sister who had not survived to be remembered by a completed mark. The wax traces found on the floor were analyzed in 2013. The wax was not Ottoman, it was older, mixed with lavender and rosemary, herbs that nuns kept in their gardens for liturgical candles, which meant the vigil had lasted longer than anyone thought possible. Not weeks, months, perhaps years. These women gathered in this room night after night, year after year, carving prayers into stone and whispering psalms into the darkness. In a palace where no one was supposed to know they existed, the crosses stop. Halfway through the wall, the scratches change. The careful marks become erratic, uneven. Some cut too deep, some half-finished. One near the end cuts sideways across 3 other crosses, as if the hand making it had slipped, or shaken, or simply lost the precision that comes from calm. Then nothing. Ottoman records from 1482 mention in a single administrative line a rationalization of palace staff under the new sultan, disposal of non-productive and resistant elements, lower residential staff, implemented, no names, no numbers, no burial sites. 1 line, filed, closed. The nuns of St. Catherine vanished from history. 18 women who had walked 7 days through the mountains, crossed the Aegean in chains, descended into the foundation of the most powerful palace in the world, and carved their faith into its walls year after year. Gone. A French diplomat in 1712 wrote in his private journal about a conversation with an elderly Greek palace servant. She told him that on certain nights, in the deepest corridors, you could hear women's voices, singing in a language that wasn't Turkish and wasn't Greek. He stood in the lower corridor for an hour with a candle. He heard nothing. He concluded it was superstition, but he wrote it down anyway. When archaeologists published their analysis of the hidden chamber in 2012, they were careful and scholarly. But in the final paragraph, the lead archaeologist allowed herself 1 sentence outside the academic register. The physical evidence suggests that these individuals maintained their practice for a period far exceeding what would normally be considered psychologically possible under the documented conditions. The mechanism by which they sustain this is not recoverable from the archaeological record. But the fact of it is not in question. The fact of it is not in question. The Ottoman Empire lasted until 1922. 600 years, 3 continents. The greatest cathedral in Christendom turned into a mosque. Administrative systems so efficient they became models for modern states. Its sultans are dust. Its armies are memory. The palace still stands. But it is a museum now. Thousands of tourists walk through it every day. They photograph the harem. They admire the treasuries. They stand on the terraces and look out at the Bosphorus. Most never know about the corridors below, but those corridors are still there. And in one small room in the farthest corner of the deepest tunnel, the crosses are still there. And the Latin phrase, barely visible after 500 years, still speaks. Lux in tenebris lucet. From the first chapter of the Gospel of John. a verse about light that exists before creation and cannot be extinguished by any darkness. Sister Magdalena carved those words knowing she would never leave that palace, knowing her name would not appear in any record, knowing the world would continue without her as if she had never existed. She carved them anyway, because she understood something that empires, in all their calculation and power, have never fully grasped. You can conquer land. You can rewrite calendars and rename cities. You can melt the bells and plaster over the mosaics. You can erase names from ledgers. But you cannot reach inside what people carry. You cannot extinguish what they scratch into stone. Sister Magdalena's bird is still there. And beside it, scratched so faintly it almost wasn't there, 2 words in Greek: we endure. Not we survived, not we won, we endure. Present tense. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The false wall they built over the chapel was broken open by contractors looking for something else entirely. And those crosses, carved by women, the world forgot, in a room that was never supposed to exist, by hands that had nothing left but faith and broken pottery, and the will to leave a mark. Those crosses are still there, waiting to be found. You just found them. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.